Hey, welcome everybody to our event and a good evening to you. Welcome to the Hank Center and another installment in our Catholicism and Dialogue series. Tonight's offering is The Storm Cloud of the 21st Century, Capitalism, the Technocratic Paradigm, and the Sacramental Imagination with Professor Eugene McCarraher and a response by Professor Daniel Rhodes. My name is Michael Murphy, and it's my great honor to serve as director of the Hank Center. And on behalf of the Hank family, whose generous endowment funds our many endeavors, and on behalf of university leadership, and on behalf of Commonweal Magazine, who are co-sponsoring this event, I extend a warm greeting to all assembled here in the Zoom space. Let me also add a greeting on behalf of our dedicated center staff, Center Manager Megan Toomey, our graduate student assistant Kathleen McNutt, and our undergraduate assistants, the intrepid Catherine and Francis. I'm very grateful, I remain so, for their dedicated work. And together we welcome you, Zoom group, Jean and Dan. The original impetus for this evening was to distill and amplify intersections between Pope Francis's thought, particularly in his game-changing encyclical from 2015, Laudato Si, and a contemporary interdisciplinary scholar whose work might serve as a constructive conversation partner. With Jean, we get that and so much more. Jean has been a most fertile public intellectual for many years. His recent Enchantments of Mammon, long in the McCarraher crucible and published last year, it's right here, is his tour de force. Like Charles Taylor's 2007 A Secular Age, Jean's book, with its expansive yet precise qualities, is a text that comes along just once in a generation. So let me suggest also that these two books become good companion pieces to one another, and they'd make excellent stocking stuffers for the serious readers in your life. Maybe not stocking stuffers because they weigh 5 pounds each, but you get my drift. Jean's talk and Dan's response are part of our 2-day focus on the thought of Pope Francis in dialogue with culture. It's so wonderful that we have Fratelli Tutti hot off the press, and it came into our midst 10 days ago, Pope Francis's most recent encyclical letter. The content in Fratelli Tutti is a perfect companion to Laudato Si. I've been through it kind of once in a, kind of a skim read, but the letter, Fratelli Tutti, amplifies so much of what was promised in Laudato Si. It was kind of left on the, not the floor, but is, taken up again. And so I think, as they say, a bird doesn't fly on one wing, and this is another great companion piece. So tomorrow we have a most excellent group that's going to take up Fratelli Tutti, and we're calling it Fratelli Tutti, a conversation addressing Pope Francis's new encyclical on human solidarity and its socio-political implications for the United States. And that's with Sean Copeland, Bishop John Stowe, Carmen Nanco Fernandez, John Gehring, and our colleague, Ambassador Miguel Diaz, will moderate. So this event also is free, but we need you to register if you're interested, and please be our guest. And you can check the other events, which you saw on the waiting room slide as well. We have free Zoom. A lot of it's really about religion and politics, which of course are everybody's favorite topics. A note on our format before I introduce our speakers. This Zoomcast is classified as a webinar, which means that while the chat is disabled, you can ask questions and offer comments for response through the Q&A feature. I encourage you to listen actively as Jean speaks and Dan responds, and really just write the question in or comment as you're prompted by their insights. And that way we have plenty of things to talk about after Dan responds. All right. So without further ado, as they say, let us begin by welcoming through a biographical description first, and then Jean will begin. So Eugene McCarraher is Professor of Humanities and History at Villanova University. In addition to publishing scholarly articles, he has also written many essays and book reviews for many publications, including our co-sponsor Commonweal, Hedgehog Review, and Raritan. Jean has been a fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Council of Learned Societies. He's the author of Christian Critics, Religion and the Impasse in Modern American Social Thought. That's from Cornell in 2000. And most recently, as we mentioned, The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity. And that's from Belknap Press out of Harvard Press, so an imprint of Harvard from 2019. Gene's current research is on the human implications of technology, especially of automation, and he's also working on a history of small c communism. Daniel P. Rhodes is Clinical Associate Professor and Director of Contextual Education at the Institute of Pastoral Studies here at Loyola Chicago. His work crosses the divides between the academy, the church, and society with an emphasis on community organizing, education, ecclesiology, political theology, and ethics. His latest co-edited book with Charles Marsh and Shay Tuttle is Can I Get a Witness? 13 Peacemakers, Community Builders, and Agitators for Faith and Justice. And that's from Erdman's from last year. So we have a lot in store for us. And without further ado, for a second time, I want to welcome you, Gene McCarraher, and the stage is yours.
Thanks, Mike. First, I'd like to thank Mike and his colleagues at the Hanks Center for inviting me to give this lecture this evening. I'd also like to say that if you do order my book and that if you do order Charles Taylor's book, even if you don't read them, you could probably do bicep curls with them. So it would be very good for you physically as well as intellectually. I'm also grateful to those of you who are attending this lecture virtually. I'm certain that John Ruskin, who's one of my heroes, from who you'll be hearing shortly, would have been appalled at the very idea of virtual anything. And he would undoubtedly have shouted from the rooftops that it was an abomination. But we're lucky to have it in these pandemical times, for which I'm equally certain Ruskin would have had a precise and searing diagnosis. It's to Ruskin's diagnosis of the climate of England in the late Victorian era that I want to turn as a point of departure for my remarks this evening. Among his ensemble of talents, art historian, accomplished draftsman, eloquent scourge of capitalist modernity, that of prescient prophet of ecological disaster is another that needs to be recalled. In his eerie and foreboding The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, published in 1884, Ruskin discerned moral and metaphysical plague in the English skies. The clouds, he wrote, bore traces of iniquity. Bitterness and malice infected the winds, and poisonous smoke made of dead men's souls bellowed from the satanic factories. And his illustrations of the sky are just as ominous as his prose. The desecration, Ruskin thought, extended everywhere. Blasphemy, Ruskin pronounced it. Blanched sun, blighted grass, blinded man. Everything was this violation of the visible heaven that ruined, quote, all the good works and purposes of nature. The judgment of history would be harsh, Ruskin rued, for, quote, of states in such moral gloom, every seer of old predicted the physical gloom. Still, the forecast wasn't entirely despairing. The nefarious smog would dissipate with the arrival of what Ruskin called hope, reverence, and love. Ancient virtues, rooted in a conviction that he had expressed with such eloquent pithiness earlier in his career in Unto This Last, that, quote, there is no wealth but life. The hallucinogenic quality of Ruskin's vision in this, one of his last books, has caused even many of his admirers to attribute it to early stage dementia. Perhaps, but as the wonderful William James reminds us in The Varieties of Religious Experience, mental illness and spiritual insight are not mutually exclusive categories. Still, even if we credit James, Ruskin's prescribed therapy for a bedeviled planet will seem quaint and even retrograde to many. Relying primarily on the soul rather than on instrumental rationality, it appears irrelevant and even oblivious when the most popular response to ecological trauma is a battery of technological fixes. It's bad enough that so many Americans deny the scientific evidence of climate change. itself an appallingly anodyne term that disguises the enormity of the coming cataclysm. What's also dispiriting is that even those respectful of empirical reality exhibit little sense of the scope and magnitude of the changes necessary in our lives. Driving eco-friendly cars, installing more efficient light bulbs, sorting the trash more wisely, funding innovation in geoengineering. These and other rights of green consciousness comprise the latest fashion in bourgeois moralism. But even cumulatively, they amount to little in the way of fundamental transformation. As with income inequality, another decaffeinated term, this one cloaking the reality of class conflict, Americans, it appears, want change without changing too much. The preservation of the American way of life remains paramount, even in the face of mounting evidence that that way of life itself is part of the problem. Likewise, the most sensitive oracles of planetary tribulation insist that we need not just new modes of production, but a new conception of our place in nature. As Naomi Klein realizes, quote, post-Enlightenment Western culture does not offer a roadmap for how to live that is not based on an extractivist, non-reciprocal relationship with nature. We need, she asserts, nothing less than what she calls a new civilizational paradigm. I want to suggest this afternoon that Ruskin's macabre, phantasmagorical apprehension of ecological disaster, far from being delirious or inconsequential, offers a lucid and penetrating account of our war on the natural world. It points both to the nefarious impact of capitalism on the biosphere, anticipating Pope Francis' indictment of what he calls the technocratic paradigm, a concept that I want both to affirm and to critique, and to a capital R romantic sacramental imagination, which I'll argue is indispensable to fashioning a post-capitalist ecological vision and politics. In the second paragraph of Laudato Si', Francis demonstrates an affinity with Ruskin about the intimate connection of spiritual and ecological disorder. Quote, the violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life, end quote. We can't afford to be indifferent to Ruskin's hallowed trinity of virtues if we want to avoid or mitigate the damage that will be wrought by the storm cloud of the 21st century. I want first to discuss and critique Pope Francis' remarks on the technocratic paradigm in Laudato Si', situate the ecological concerns that Ruskin shared with Francis within his broader attack on capitalist economics, and trace that indictment to a fundamentally sacramental imagination that he also shares with Francis, and conclude by giving a very, very rough sketch of the sort of political economy of ecological flourishing. Perhaps the most controversial section of Laudato Si' is Francis' account and condemnation of what he calls the technocratic paradigm, which stretches across paragraphs 106 to 136 of the encyclical's third chapter, entitled The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis. That's a not so veiled retort to Lynn White's 1966 essay, The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, in which the historian argued that mounting environmental damage could be traced to the Judeo-Christian conviction that God had bestowed dominion over the planet to human beings. Rejecting White's equation of that dominion with what he calls, quote, a Promethean vision of mastery over the world, Francis locates the roots of our ecological predicament in, quote, an undifferentiated and one-dimensional paradigm for developing and using technology. This technocratic paradigm, as he dubs it, posits, quote, a subject who, using logical and rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object, end quote, which is conceived, Francis remarks, quote, as something formless, completely open to manipulation, end quote. This commanding, if not imperious subject employs the scientific and experimental method, which is, in Francis' view, quote, already a technique of possession, mastery, and transformation, end quote. Anticipating the obvious objection that human beings have always sought to exert some degree of control over the rest of the natural world, Francis differentiates this modern paradigm of mastery from previous forms of dominion. Before the ascendancy of the technocratic paradigm, he contends, human efforts to shape and master nature were, quote, in tune with and respected the possibilities offered by the things themselves, end quote. Things were not, that is, seen as he had formerly said, formless, completely open to manipulation. And mastery was thus, quote, a matter of receiving what nature itself allowed as if from its own hand, end quote. The relationship between the instruments of dominion and nature is conceived here as a collaborative, amiable, even loving process in which human beings practice receptivity as well as mastery and acknowledge the real material limitations on their ability to control, produce, and fabricate. Under the technocratic paradigm, however, this respectful and even reverent relationship gives way to relentless, unending exploitation. A, quote, confrontational relationship, in Francis' words, a combative and violent struggle in which human beings seek both to establish unrestricted supremacy over nature and to, quote, extract everything possible from it, end quote. Believing that through technological expertise, they can sustain an economy of, quote, infinite or unlimited growth, end quote. Worse, the technocratic paradigm has become not just a model for human dominion over the rest of nature, but also, and even more insidiously, quote, an epistemological paradigm, which shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society, end quote. Human beings turn the technocratic paradigm upon themselves so as to extract everything they can in terms of efficiency and productivity. In this way, Francis warns, quote, technology tends to absorb everything into its ironclad logic, end quote. For Francis, the technocratic paradigm is another term for what Max Weber once called the disenchantment of the world, the evacuation of spiritual forces from the world so as to unleash technological control for the purpose of human prosperity. The logic of technology sanctions a host of inhumane developments, two of which Francis discusses. Automation, in which labor, which should be a way for human beings to cultivate and express their talents, is supplanted by machines. And the emergence of biotechnologies, which dislocate farmers, diminish biodiversity, destroy ecosystems, and concentrate control over agricultural production in the hands of global corporations. From this analysis, Francis draws two conclusions. First, he observes, quote, technological products are not neutral, end quote. An insight that runs contrary to the common wisdom that knowledges, machines, and devices constitute an amoral, apolitical, and non-ideological edifice of instrumentality which can be used for any purpose. In other words, because they are designed by human beings, instruments inevitably embody human purposes. Means are inseparable from ends. The non-neutrality of technical means implies, second, that, quote, decisions which may seem purely instrumental are in reality decisions about the kind of society we want to build, end quote. A rebuke that reminds us that words such as practical and efficient are always empty and misleading unless they point to an objective in whose terms something is practical or efficient. Since the triumph of the technocratic paradigm is responsible for looming ecological catastrophe, it must be repudiated, Francis maintains, in favor of a new, or perhaps better, old but renovated paradigm through which humanity can, quote, recover the values and the great goods swept away by our unrestricted delusions of grandeur, end quote. He sketches what he calls an integral or social ecology, in which cultural, economic, and ecological issues are perceived as interrelated, represented, Francis writes, by, quote, cooperatives of small producers who adopt less polluting means of product and opt for a non-consumerist model of life, recreation, and community, end quote. But the feature of Francis' ecological imagination that I want to highlight is its sacramental quality. Invoking the cultures of indigenous peoples whose habitats are being stolen and contaminated, he lauds their belief that, quote, land is not a commodity, but rather a gift from God, a sacred space with which they need to interact, end quote. All of nature, he marvels at one point, is, quote, imbued with the radiant presence of God. Quote, to contemplate creation, Francis asserts elsewhere, quote, is to hear a message. Divinity conveys its power and love, he reminds us, quote, even in the last speck of dust of our planet, end quote. What Gerard Manley Hopkins called the dearest freshness deep down things envelops the entire universe, beckoning us, Francis assures us, into, quote, universal communion with all created things, calling on us to relinquish the authoritarian desire for technological hegemony. Francis issues an invitation into what he calls openness to awe and wonder that will, he trusts, reestablish, quote, fraternity and beauty in our relationship with nature, end quote. What I want to emphasize about Francis' ecological vision is that it rests not on a moral and political claim about the primacy of the common good, but on an ontological claim about the nature of the universe. That its architecture is thoroughly leavened by what Dante called the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Francis' excoriation of the technocratic paradigm and his adumbration of a sacramental ecology make Laudato Si one of the most perspicacious moral and spiritual documents of our time. Forthright in its anathema upon the desire for unbridled power, uncompromisingly bleak in its portrayal of the depredation that has immiserated so much of the world, and breathtakingly hopeful in its central conviction that, as Hopkins put it, nature is never spent, precisely because of the dearest freshness deep down things. It captures well the inexorable consequences of the vision of an earlier Francis, Sir Francis Bacon, that is, who advanced the Promethean claims of the new science and technology at the advent of modernity. As the savants and technicians on the island of Ben Salem declare in Bacon's The New Atlantis, an early prototype of the modern alliance between scientific endeavor and industrial enterprise, quote, the end of our foundation is the knowledge of causes and the secret motions of things, and the enlarging of the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible, end quote. The relentless expansion of human empire required a thoroughly utilitarian conception of the natural world. The objective of the new scientific method, Bacon asserted in his Novum Organum, was to, quote, bind her to your service and make her your slave, end quote. Rooted in spiritual blight, this project of ecological subjugation has culminated, Francis shows, not in universal affluence, but rather in global derangement. In the second paragraph of Laudato Si, Francis demonstrates an affinity with Ruskin about the intimate connection of spiritual and ecological disorder. Quote, the violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life, end quote. Bacon was writing not only at the advent of modernity, but at the dawn of capitalism. And it's the capitalist character of scientific and technological modernity that I think Francis tends to ignore or obscure, and which Ruskin, I think, helps us better to remember and to confront. To be sure, Francis does, on occasion, signal an acute awareness that our ecological woes stem directly from, quote, our current models of production and consumption, end quote. He laments that, quote, the economy accepts every advance in technology with a view to profit, end quote. He clearly names the champions of the technocratic paradigm, quote, economists, financiers, and experts in technology, end quote. In other words, the business clerisy, the monetary wizards, and the Silicon Valley tech bros who comprise the intelligentsia of neoliberal capitalism. There are numerous other instances in which Francis appears to link ecological pestilence to the everyday mechanisms of capital accumulation. And yet, Francis never once calls the system by its name, relying instead on any number of euphemisms and circumlocutions to avoid doing so. Alas, I think this reluctance or dereliction, or whatever you want to call it, both renders insufficient his account of the technocratic paradigm and also limits its political imagination. Now, I understand that an encyclical is not a historical narrative, and neither is it a policy statement or a political manifesto. And I understand that ever since Rerum Novarum, popes have been shy about saying anything that sounds even remotely socialist or Marxist or revolutionary. If I may be so presumptuous as to offer Francis my advice, I tell him that the time for such evasiveness is over. If the right wants to call you a communist, let them. They already have, and nothing you say or don't say won't stop them. And you're in a very distinguished company by my lights. As I'll suggest in a few moments, Ruskin knew a thing or two about communism. First, the insufficiencies. Francis' lack of historical specificity leads him, as it led earlier critics such as Friedrich Junger, Martin Heidegger, and Jacques Ellul, to write of an undifferentiated technology that appears to act as a historical agent in its own right, unfettered from the purposes and control of the human beings who create it. Recall how Francis asserts that, quote, technology tends to absorb everything into its ironclad logic, not the pecuniary logic of the capitalist class shared by the professional and managerial stewards who act as its faithful artisans and stewards. Here, Francis seems to forget his own admonition that technology is not neutral. On this score, Francis would have done well to consult, wait for it, the Karl Marx of Capital, who demonstrates that the introduction of mechanization into the capitalist factory has and will always be about gaining greater control over workers and the work process, and about augmenting the surplus value that capital can extract from labor. Ironically, Marx saw this capitalist logic as part of a dialectical process of emancipation. That he was wrong only underscores my point. Indeed, there's a long line of historians, from Lewis Mumford to Harry Braverman to David F. Noble, who have documented the capitalist imperatives that have shaped technologies down to their very selection and design. At the same time, Francis' unwillingness to name the system threatens at times to turn the encyclical into yet another exercise in moralism. Take the many imprecations against consumerism. Because they often reduce consumption to a moral issue, critics of consumerism engage in a tiresome and largely ineffectual moralism, one of the more condescending forms of bourgeois virtue signaling in a field already far too crowded. But historians and theologians might remind us that consumption is far more than a moral affair. However deftly and beguilingly the culture industries prey on some of the worst features of human nature, consumerism is a structural imperative of the modern capitalist economy. Preaching Jeremiads, religious or secular, has been of little discernible avail against the necessities of accumulation. As I always say, talking about consumerism is a way of not talking about capitalism. And if, as Francis himself constantly insists, matter is good, material life should be cherished and savored as the sensuous gift of creation. Finally, the hesitancy about naming capitalism introduces an incoherence into the political implications of integral or social ecology. Quote, business is a noble vocation, Francis remarks, quote, directed to producing wealth and improving our world, especially, he adds, when it, quote, sees the creation of jobs as an essential part of its service to the common good, end quote. I'll put to one side a discussion about the connotations of the word business. Amidst all the Ayn Randian palaver about job creators, let's be clear about something. The purpose of business under capitalism is to accumulate capital, not to create jobs or to serve the common good. Why are businesses automating production and services at such an accelerating clip? Because it cheapens labor costs and increases profits. Work under capitalism is not arranged or performed so as to allow the worker to flourish. It's arranged and performed, and I might add, increasingly surveilled, so as to enforce greater discipline over workers. In order to foster ecological sensitivity and beloved community, those producer cooperatives on whom Francis places such high hopes would have to conduct their work and employ their technology within a very different institutional logic. Now, while he shared Francis' sacramental imagination, Ruskin realized more acutely, I think, that capitalism lay at the root of our ecological crisis, that capitalism was generating the ecological conditions for the storm clouds of the coming centuries. From his earliest art criticism of the 1840s to his later speculations on climate, Ruskin wrote of natural beauty as an enchanted emblem of divinity. At their best, he argued in the first volume of Modern Painters, artists conveyed, quote, that faultless, ceaseless, inconceivable, inexhaustible loveliness which God has stamped upon all things, end quote. Beauty, he wrote in the second volume of Modern Painters, is, quote, that external quality of bodies which, whether occur in a stone, flower, beast, or in man, may be shown to be in some sort typical of the divine attributes, end quote. In animals, the appearance of these godlike qualities indicated, quote, the felicitous fulfillment of function in living things. In the human animal especially, beauty consisted, quote, in the joyful and right exertion of perfect life in man. Quote, in the midst of the material nearness of these heavens, Ruskin asserted in the fourth volume, God desires that we, quote, acknowledge his own immediate presence as visiting, judging, and blessing us. To Ruskin, nature was not inanimate, but rather soulful, even ethical, a vessel and a barometer of moral and ontological vitality. In the work of Iron, he invited his audience to read, quote, the curious lesson in any pebble at their feet. Quote, you look upon it as if it were earth only. But the pebble possessed, quote, a kind of soul. And if it could speak so that we could hear a message, as Francis would say, it would inform us that, quote, I am not earth. I am earth and air in one. Part of that blue heaven which you love and long for is already in me, end quote. When Ruskin reported on his ominous storm cloud, he was deciphering signs of sacrilege as well as recording ecological illness. This sacramental ontology was the foundation of Ruskin's equally sacramental humanism. As he wrote in volume 2 of Modern Painters, the function of a human being is, quote, the full comprehension and contemplation of the beautiful as a gift of God. The use and function of a person, he wrote, is to be, quote, the witness of the glory of God and to advance that glory by reasonable obedience and resultant happiness. Quote, the direct manifestation of deity to man is in his own image, that is, in man, he avowed in volume 5. The soul of man is a mirror of the mind of God, he wrote, a mirror dark, distorted, and broken, he lamented, but reflective nonetheless of divinity. So far, so in line with Francis. But if for Francis, the, quote, technocratic paradigm is a dynamo of secular modernity, For Ruskin, capitalism embodied a metamorphosis of the sacred, a perverse enchantment of the world. Ruskin realized that the technocratic paradigm is really a capitalist form of idolatry, a re-enchantment of the world conducted under the gilded, unholy auspices of capital. In The Political Economy of Art, Ruskin described the day of a typical businessman as a regimen of spiritual discipline. Quote, "The worship of mammon," he began, "proceeds with, quote, a tender reverence and an exact propriety. The merchant, quote, rises to his mammon matins with the self-denial of an anchorite," end quote, and asks forgiveness for the distractions that may keep him from his, quote, mammon vespers. Later, in Munera Pulveris, Ruskin maintained that far from a secular denial of the supernatural, capitalism had its own ensemble of gods, sacraments, and spiritual devotions. Quote, "We have indeed a nominal religion to which we pay tithes of property and sevenths of time," he conceded. Quote, "But we have also a practical and earnest religion to which we devote 9/10 of our property and 6/7 of our time. The deity of this true Victorian faith was, quote, the goddess of getting on, in male form, Mammon, quote, the great evil spirit of false and fond desire, or covetousness, which is idolatry." Ruskin's insight into the perversely sacramental character of capitalism enabled him, I think, to be more forthright about the alternative, small c communism. Though often dismissed as a reactionary, indeed, he once referred to himself as, quote, a violent Tory of the old school. Ruskin was one of the principal heroes of William Morris, R.H. Tawney, G.D.H. Cole, and others among the first two generations of British socialists. In Fors Clavigera, his collection of open letters to industrial workers, Ruskin proudly called himself, quote, a communist of the old school, reddest of the red. Ruskin's old school communism differed from that of Marx in two significant respects. First, where for Marx, communism would be the consummation of a Promethean project of industrial development, a project that required mammon service, and thus entailed the technocratic paradigm as a moment in the dialectic of history. For Ruskin, communism defied the historical necessity of avarice and its industrialized despotism. Second, where Marx emphasized communism as a form of property, common ownership, Ruskin emphasized communism as a principle of morality, from each according to ability, to each according to need. The Marxist objection to Ruskin's communism has often been that it idealizes a petty bourgeois economy of small producers, whose private property relations subvert all their earnest professions of charity. In the Marxist scenario, this is both reactionary. Communism, in this view, is the result of capitalist consolidation that prepares industry for collective expropriation. And it's ideological as well, since the Christian morality in this view obscures and sanctions the continuation of competition. Marxists and capitalists agree that there is private, namely capitalist property, and there is common collectivized property. There is no other property form. But recall Ruskin's shorthand definition of communism. Our property belongs to everybody, and everybody's property belongs to us, end quote. This suggests a form of property that fudges the distinction between private and common. Indeed, it suggests that private property is never really private. Anything but ironic, Ruskin's communism forces us to reconsider what we mean by property in the first place. As David Graeber once reminded us, quote, property is not really a relation between a person and a thing. It's an understanding or arrangement between people concerning things. Someone alone on an island, Graeber once mused, doesn't worry about property rights. If property is thus always a social relation, then property is private only because we've all agreed or been forced to accept that it should be. So it's perfectly possible to imagine property systems in which what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine, depending on how we've defined our relationship. Anthropologists and jurists have a name, though it's an ugly one, for a form of social relation in which a person or a people can claim rights to objects owned by others. Usufruct. It's common among archaic and tribal peoples. I own a tool, but if you need it, it's yours, as long as you don't damage it. Ownership, in this view, depends on use. Property is a kind of social trust that will use things for the common good. As vehemently as most Christians believe private, read capitalist property is part of the ontological essence of creation, usufruct was the governing principle of ownership among ancient and medieval Christian writers. It's there in Luke's account of the early Christians. Quote, no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. In St. Basil's injunction about surplus goods, the bread that you keep belongs to the hungry, the cloak in your closet to the naked. And in St. Thomas Aquinas's argument for, quote, the universal destination of goods. Although Francis continues this lineage by writing in Laudato Si of, quote, a social mortgage on private property, end quote, he appears to mean that a social mortgage can be placed on capitalist property. As I've suggested, it can't and never will be. Ruskin's communism is usufruct applied to the means of production. Ownership of any enterprise that produces goods or provides care, wealth, hinges on the value and valiance of the owners. The production or provision of what Ruskin once called ILF, any service or good that's bad for us, would thus disqualify ownership and justify expropriation. At the same time, communist property, in Ruskin's terms, entails a beloved community of workers, not acquisitive individualists who accumulate profits by undercutting wages, degrading dexterity and skill, and endangering the biosphere. Technological innovation would surely take a very different form in this kind of communism, with productivity subordinate to the cultivation of mental and manual ingenuity. Far from Marx's Promethean vision of full automation and industrial titanism, oddly enough, the culmination of a capitalist project, Ruskin's communism would eventuate in a sacramental, ecologically sensitive political economy in which men and women could fulfill their human nature. Now, to be sure, as a Tory of the old school, Ruskin himself was unabashedly paternalist in his conception of communism. The manufacturer, he observed, and unto this last, is the, quote, governor of the men employed by him, end quote. Yet to be employed is to be a wage laborer, the mark of dispossession from the means of production. Ruskin's Tory insistence on hierarchy was thus already too much of a concession to the imperatives of industrial capitalism. A more robustly democratic and egalitarian conception of communism is surely needed in our time, one in which workers who, owning the means of production and reclaiming technological acumen, could reconcile the virtues of craftsmanship and automation in an ecologically friendly fashion. My discussion of political economy may seem like a long detour from discussion of ecology, but as Francis himself acknowledges, the property and production relations of society are intimately intertwined with its spiritual and material relationships to the rest of nature. I'm more and more convinced that only some sort of radically democratic economics, leavened by a sacramental sensibility and achieved through a politics of loving nonviolence, constitutes the most compelling alternative to a pecuniary, instrumentalist desecration of people, other animals, and the rest of creation. That paradigm is dying already. The languid senescence of capitalism will be, I think, one of the major storylines of our era. As the ecological denouement of that paradigm, The storm cloud of the 21st century is already upon us. Some degree of devastation, perhaps considerable, is already our unavoidable fate. But as Hopkins would remind us, the dearest freshness deep down things will never mislead or abandon us. If we abide and trust in that freshness, we might still be able to rescue what's left of the real wealth that is life. Thank you.
Thanks, Gene. Now, I want to start again by thanking Gene for such a concise and rich account of the current situation, as well as Francis's diagnosis and his, if I might call it this, Ruskinite irritation that he's provided us. It's particularly exciting for me to respond to Gene's remarks, and I'll try to be brief here, because he's been so helpful for me in my own thinking and thinking my way through some of the problems and the mess of the church's embrace of capitalism. Let's just say, were I to write a book by the title of, oh, I don't know, Christian Critics, Gene would no doubt be a chapter of his own. So thanks, Gene, and thanks to Mike Murphy and to the Hank Center for the opportunity to engage here. Now, I want to clear something up right away. Everything Gene just said is exactly right. However, I want to pick up on a few points he mentions, with the hope of pressing more intently the critique of the technocratic paradigm and the capitalist drive that I think lies behind it. I think this will help also press the sacramental imagination he offers via Ruskin to counter this prevailing idolatry. Now, there's much to laud in this encyclical, as both Mike and Gene have said. And as a Protestant outsider, it engenders, I admit, some deep envy in me for something even remotely close to an authoritative, unified voice on the climate disaster we and our children confront. At the top of its accomplishments, I see Francis's refusal to divorce the crisis of poverty from that of our planet. He will suffer no Whole Food shopping hipster fools who entertain notions of their own moral green superiority and thereby implicitly believe that saving the planet can be done while keeping a safe neighborhood distance from the poor or by scientifically curtailing their reproduction. He's clear, the Pope is clear, that a theological vision for Christians rejects tout court any neo-Malthusian or social Darwinian approach to the question of ecological stabilization. Our focus in this webinar, however, is on the technocratic paradigm. So like Gene, I'll focus my attention on the cluster of issues raised in this part of the document. Here I want to build off what Gene has said in order to push a few points just a little bit further. The main issue here, and it's related to the hesitation to name the system of capitalism, as Gene has pointed out, is that despite Francis's admonition that justice for the poor must be integrated into a true ecological approach, one would not be wrong to suggest that, the critiques of the Northern Hemisphere and their nations notwithstanding, there's a similar continued attempt to play Swiss, if I can say it that way, when it comes to the politics of globalization. Now, to begin, I think it's worth stating again that the modern scientific and technological project critiqued by Francis and so well exposed by Gene will not be saved from itself by innovation. We need to name this false hope because it indeed, I think, works as a bit of a narcotic to induce political apathy, even for those who are steeped in maybe what we're all becoming so steeped in, cynical realism. While not named as one of the weak responses to ecological and human devastation in the first chapter of the encyclical, I, not unlike Gene, think we must follow Marx in order to look more closely at the creative capacity of capitalism and the creative agency that shapes its technology. Hope and innovation sustains faith in capitalism, re-enchanting the process of desecration. Those of you that have had your Schumpeter for Dummies know that. This is also why innovators are the high priests of the system. cast as those who will lead us to the future of complete mastery over nature, deploying new technologies to solve, to riff a bit off of Wendell Berry, the problems created by technology. Only more faith in capitalism can solve the problems capital creates. For instance, buying your ethos water from Starbucks. Only capitalist solutions seem to be realistic. And yet, as Gene has named, innovation under capitalism, especially late capitalism, has not proved so innovative. The late David Graeber, who Gene also mentioned, points this out quite wittily in an essay where he asks, "Whatever happened to flying cars?" The point being that most innovation within capitalism in the past 40 years or so has been shaped by investment not in technologies associated with creating alternative futures, but only really those aimed at disciplining labor, further extracting or engaging in extraction, and colonizing new fields of property. I put forth as evidence the amount of time in the recent vice presidential debate spent talking about fracking and each side's commitment to it. I mean, fracking? Really? One would not be entirely out of line to compare this to an argument about which candidate is more committed to the old Southern practice of dueling as a way of resolving disputes or challenges to one's honor. And yet it seems common sense, almost irrational within the irrational rationality of capitalism, to consider fracking antiquated, uncivilized, and in need of complete immediate elimination. Needless to say, the promised future of leisure, abundance, and wondrous opportunity has yet to be innovated, though it's always just around the corner, we're assured. Gene has pointed out Francis's own discussion of automation, and this is one of the key areas of innovation within capitalism. And yet, maybe no other mechanism has been so potent in its capacity to discipline labor. And this wave is just beginning. If you're not familiar with the blog of the London-based Marxist economist Michael Roberts, I suggest it to you. As he notes, McKinsey Consulting estimates that automation will replace or eliminate 53 million positions in Europe alone by 2030. That's 20% of the workforce. The surplus army looking for work generated by this displacement will only drive down already suppressed wages, giving labor less share of profits. And if you were still saying to yourself, "Yes, Dan, but won't this decrease working hours, giving more to play and leisure?" The answer is assuredly no. Keynes was wrong. As automation has increased, we're all only working more, even though worker productivity continues to increase. Of course, this has and will hit the least skilled the most, but all of us find ourselves experiencing the kind of de-skilling named by Marx as part of this technological advance. As Roberts puts it, Michael Roberts, the economist, puts it, quote, "For the vast majority, going out to work in jobs that offer no creativity, pay badly, and are increasingly insecure will remain the norm. More toil, not less work." Hence the explosive creation of tech-subservient bullshit jobs, also named by David Graeber. Just consider the amount of time, for those of us that are in the teaching profession, professors here, that you've spent readying and tweaking and troubleshooting your Sakai site or your platform that delivers your class, instead of working through the material you're supposed to be teaching. In the end, we're all getting sucked into the vortex of fragile, underpaid bullshit jobs as capital struggles to maintain the lion's share of profit, even as the rate of that profit continues to fall. Now, of course, the Holy Father doesn't use this term, but he also sees this trend, even as he doesn't exactly go after the spirit of neoliberal capitalism. Although I'm thinking in Fratelli Tutti, this next conversation that you have, some of this I think is going to come out, so we'll see. Now, another dimension of innovation under capitalism has been its capacities to colonize or privatize new territories and resources. Here, the Pope is right to name financial innovation. The growth of the fire or finance, insurance, and real estate industry has been massive. Currently, and this is even an older stat here, nearly a quarter of the largest 2,000 firms in the entire world are banks and financial institutions. Even as the business of these firms is increasingly to siphon profit out of individual and corporate futures. It's a profit that creates debt. Winners and losers, we are told, are the facts of life. Financial innovation and debt create real problems and distorted growth, not just skirting the common good, but actively destroying it. I mean, think about this for a second. Currently, 1 in 5 publicly traded companies has gone what's called zombie, meaning its rate of profit is so low that it only services its debt and continues to survive just merely on credit. Debt in emerging markets is up from 40 to 60% of GDP, spurred along by the pandemic. As rates of profit continue to fall, a severe economic earthquake seems more and more inevitable. This will indeed only greatly exacerbate the disparity, already grossly extreme on a global scale. We need to be able to say that capitalism has passed its sale-by date, and continuing to rely on it poisons the entire planet. The best thing to have happened, and think about this for a second, the best thing to have happened for the environment is the massive shutdown induced by this pandemic. This shows exactly the kind of trap that we're currently caught in. Furthermore, much of the financial innovation mentioned above has advanced on the back of the new digital turn in capital. Now, this is key because the shift in the composition of capital is also giving rise to new kinds of extraction and exploitation, even as it more invisibly and biopolitically shapes labor. Big tech thrives on things like data mining, digital communications, the algorithms, and the internet connections it makes use of to tap into stores of social commons and forms of social cooperation not previously possible to valorize. One of the things we're now experiencing is that technology is not a tool out there somewhere, but it is inside us, even as it's external to us. Here, Hart and Negri's work in assembly shows that in the newly emerging composition of capital, the site of production has shifted from the factory to society itself. Whereas previously the coordination of labor was implemented from the top down, a manager, making sure everybody's doing their job, digital platforms and machines allow for a user-based social cooperation to be valorized through a host of algorithms or data banks heretofore unimaginable. Similarly, whereas older machines deployed in factories could be thought of as crystallized past intelligence in fixed form, computers, software, and web platforms now operate with adaptive codes that not only incorporate past intelligence, but act to capture the living expansion of social intelligence. And this vast concentration of human intelligence, or these commons, are being tapped and appropriated by capitalists. Even more, these digital technologies, thinking of social media as one, make possible the appropriation of living social relations themselves for capitalist value. With this capture of living interactions and new modes of social cooperation, capital is able to shape labor and subjectivity at a whole different level. That's what I mean by it operates biopolitically, so that the life we are offered to live more comports to capital. We ourselves become instances of a living fusion of production consumption, giving shape to the new prosumer, whose affective, intellectual, and imaginative capacities are aerobicized within the circuits of capital. As Hart and Negri put it, to quote, "Machines are now subjects and workers their objects," end quote. It may be that we are already beyond the epoch of the Anthropocene and into the brave new waters of the dystopian cyber world. I'm not sure how much sense it makes to speak of an alternative cultural paradigm given the form of this new center of gravity for capital. And I'm even less optimistic about the Marxian idea embraced by Hart and Negri that capital creates its own gravediggers. It may just be that it's going to bury us all on a destroyed planet. Après-moi le déluge. Now, I don't have time to mention what goes along with all this. Maybe we'll talk about it in the questions, which is the military-industrial complex needed to manage and police a society and globe dominated by these conditions. It seems like the Lexus and the olive tree are more steel and lead than often recognized. A planet that can't breathe is filled with governments that strangle their own citizens and which wall unfortunate others into the refuse. The two are connected. Disaster apartheid, as Naomi Klein contends, is more of what the future will look like. So to my mind, we seem to need the political now as much as ever, if not more than ever. After all, as the economic eclipses the social, it also swallows and engulfs the political, suffocating it and wizening it. As Jean says, pressing Francis's own point, technology is most certainly not neutral. And the technocratic paradigm is not merely destructive of the planet and of humanity, it is indeed intended to enslave. But the new mode of this enslavement is more supple, absorbing our practices so as to shape us in its virtues while teasing freedom. We are already, and I mean, think about this. This is our current state. We're already invited by this new capital composition to push out our own cultural, even green values via social media, joining into the dialogue, to enterprise ourselves and our values, to influence others, to Google research eco-friendly options and thereby make them more popular, or to relay the virtue signals of how we're living green as we browse international markets on our screens. We live in the new dawn of the 2006 Time magazine announcement that via YouTube, we are all persons of the year, cultural change agents. Even the moral has been valorized. This is the genius of capital, that it incorporates and absorbs revolutionary energies. Taken as a whole, this shows via tech how capitalism has gained a hand over the entire social nervous system, capturing and taming the kinds of sensitivities and sensations, as well as distributions and projects made possible. I mean, think about this. I was thinking about this the other day. How much longer, and I say this a little bit facetiously, but how much longer will it be until my Amazon suggestions that always know which book I want to buy next tell me who I voted for? Of course, this person's going to be edgy, right, to appeal to me. Or for that matter, how long is it going to be until it informs us of what candidates should even run and what the cost-benefit analysis is to each of us? It appears that the storm cloud comes with an undertow, sucking all political energies into its own aggregated and individualized options. Here's where I wish the Pope were more forceful in his discussion and would pair his suggestions of subsidiarity, solidarity, and mutual participation with a political urgency and willfulness that takes sides in the class warfare that is capitalism. I'm very sympathetic to those like Harry Boyd, who see in this encyclical new possibilities for the reinvigoration of civics. But I admit, I have my doubts. When we cannot name capitalism and its depoliticizing essence as the heart of the matter. Now, I don't mean this as a cheap shot, but even in what I take to be some of the most insightful paragraphs of the encyclical, so from 112 to 114, I continue to wonder, who is the Pope talking to? And who is this we that can slow down or affect cultural revolution given these conditions, especially when so many are scrambling just merely to survive? I mean, what is cultural revolution? And this is probably the deeper question for me. What is cultural revolution without political revolution? Can these really be decoupled? Now, I know theologically we have all the time we need, but I also sense that we may not recognize that what we need to do with that time is to generate a new politics. So we end up dawdling or completely stuck. As Frederick Jameson has said, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. That's political captivity, exactly because it's a loss of grandeur, an exhaustion of any kind of reserve. And as Gene has helped us to do so, we should name this not merely as a disenchantment of the world, but really a re-enchantment, or what our friend Bill Kavanaugh has called a migration of the holy. Political economy under global capitalism has its own schema. Lord alone is market. All other political options are anathema, an assault upon the American way of life, an infidelity to the divine reign of accumulation. Now, if the world is one of competing gods, making their own claims to the holy and requiring their own sacrifices, then why not also recognize that the doxology with which Francis begins this encyclical, Laudato Si, makes ontological purchase, as Jean via Ruskin has made so plain, and thereby also makes political commitments. We need theopolitical vision and imagination that informs a post-capitalist politics. And such a vision can be immediately practical for reconceiving something, as Gina showed us, like property, which is the very basis of, to use Philip Bobbitt's term, a market state like our own. That Jean invites us with Ruskin to imagine usufruct is in some sense to suggest a revolutionary political activity aimed at ending the idolatry of capitalism as we know it and its drive for accumulation. This, I think, may be the real hope we can take for our planet. Now, in wrapping up here, I have two questions that I want to pose back to Jean. The first is aimed more, Jean, to you as a historian, and particularly a Catholic historian, especially in this setting of the Hank Center and with Commonweal, and its focus on Catholic intellectual heritage. Now, I know this story a bit more for evangelicals and Protestants broadly, but when exactly did Catholics come to savor the enchantments of mammon, American style, such that encyclicals like this one seem to be spoken to the winds, only to return empty within the Catholic fold on American soil? Moreover, why is it that there seems to be no tradition of a Catholic New Left, even an Anglo-Catholic New Left in the US, like the one charted by Jay Corin in England? How is it that we've not generated a Herbert McCabe, a Ruskin, or even a Chester Belloc? Or maybe you would say that we have in the radical priests like the Berrigans or the lay leaders like Dorothy Day, and yet none of these are or have been intellectuals per se. I don't think you'd include Father John Ryan here, maybe Vita Dutton Scudder, I'm not sure. I mean, what's the counter to the kinds of institutions that are being established in the pro-capitalist Catholic world? Is this intellectual vacuum to some extent responsible for the failure of Marxian socialism in the US and the lack of unity pointed out by Daniel Bell? Maybe you would say a better example is the vibrant critique emerging out of Black Catholic and Black Anglo-Catholic thought, or Mestizo or Latinx Catholic thought. I don't know. So that's the first question. Why do we not have a tradition of organic intellectuals, or who are these intellectuals offering a reasoned account of the new assemblies we need to create in order to receive an encyclical like this? And then this is the second question. Sorry, my questions are long. And this is a more theological question. Here I want to ask a bit more about the romantic, capital romantic, sacramental imagination you begin to lime in this presentation. My question revolves around the sense that what seems to be such a powerful tool of critique with respect to the technocratic logics of utility and efficiency, or profit, domination, competition, and limitless growth and accumulation, then becomes an impediment to self-examination and critique within the church itself. By this, I mean the way in which, because the church has been given the sacrament, a critique of itself, even in this encyclical, never really materializes. While so many more of us find ourselves working bullshit jobs, Should we not also recognize that more and more of us find ourselves attending bullshit churches? For that minority of Catholics, and I'm tempted to say or write the faithful remnant of Catholics, reading the Catholic social thought tradition, this usually surfaces as a constant frustration with the way the church poses, not unlike Ruskin, as you know, a kind of anachronistic, organic view of society to contrast the modern capitalist order. Such does not really seem to support democracy, something we should note the church itself is not exactly known for. So what kind of sacramental ontology do you think we need? And I don't mean to instrumentalize it here, in order to envision the kind of alternative you're suggesting. Would it be more rhizomatic, more of an ecologically diverse and less hierarchical order? If so, what is then the substance of its unity? And then what shape would this give to its ecclesial life? Does the ontology at times provide a political vision that actually has impeded politics internally and externally? So that's the final question. Thank you.
Well, Gene, yeah, if you want to just nibble on any one of those for a moment, then we can kind of get into some questions here from our community.
Sure.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, I want to thank Dan for those really, extraordinary remarks. God, there's so much. I could probably go on for a week talking about this. First of all, I just want to say that at the beginning, when Dan said that I got everything Gene said is exactly right, I want to say I want to salute his impeccable judgment, and I got everything right. So good night, folks. We're all done. Let me take up just a few of the many issues that Dan raised. I'm going to take the two questions that with which he ended, answer those first, and I wanted to say a couple of things about automation in regard to that. As far as when did American Catholics start to get really chummy with the enchantments of Mammon? I would argue this really got off the ground in the years after the Second World War. With the development of a Catholic professional middle class. I talk about this to some extent in my first book. Basically, it's Roman Catholic professional middle class integration into the mainstream. I don't want to say the Catholics were utterly immune to the enchantments of Mammon before this, but it seems to me that once Catholics started moving out of, quote, the Catholic ghetto in the post-war period, and they start to, get better educated, they make more money, and we're off to the races, which I think goes a long way toward explaining the phenomenon of what you'd call bullshit churches. A lot of churches where I live on the main line outside of Philadelphia are basically places where professional middle class people are told how wonderful they are and how great it is that they've accomplished so much in life, and the church parking lots are filled with BMWs and Jags. So that's my answer to your first question. Or the historical question. As you raise another question about where's the American Herbert McCabe? Where's the? I think that part of the problem here is a more general. It's a more general problem, not just with Catholics, but I think the American political tradition as a whole. Which is, I'm one of these people who actually thinks that Richard Hofstadter and Louis Hartz were right, that America has always been a liberal country. There's a lot of pushback against this idea right now. Jeet Heer in The Nation wrote a piece bashing Hofstadter, I think just recently, a few days ago. And I think Jeet makes a lot of really great points, but I still think that in the end, Hofstadter and the consensus historians were basically right. The United States has just never had a pre-liberal, pre-modern tradition on which they could draw imaginatively the way that Europeans did. I think this is one of the reasons why socialism went further in Europe than it did here, because even socialists could draw upon the idea that, capitalism wasn't always around. And even if it was an aristocratic class, that aristocratic class exemplified certain kinds of virtues that didn't have anything to do with work and productivity and so on. So I think that that explains not just why Catholics haven't developed this tradition. Americans haven't really developed much of a tradition here. Though I guess the one exception I would make, to the list that you drew was that I think that Lewis Mumford is in many ways the American Ruskin. When you look at his, not just his histories of cities, but his histories of technology, there's a very, very Ruskinian ambience about Mumford, even though I think Mumford both knew more about technology and was less, I think he was less technophobic than Ruskin. Even there, I think Ruskin's technophobia has been greatly exaggerated, for reasons that I talk about in my book. As far as what kind of sacramental oncology or ontology, I think you're gonna, I'm gonna punt on that one. I am merely a humble historian. Well, maybe I'm a historian. I am merely a humble historian. Maybe I'll punt that one to Mike, because Mike writes on these issues, and so I'll implicate him, in this discussion.
Well played.
Yeah, thank you. About automation. Okay, so this is coming from the Department of Shameless Self-Promotion. I am writing a short book, yes, a short book on automation. I'm supposed to get it done by next year. Everything you said about automation is true. And I just want to add to that. One of the things that I think is really, really, really sad about the digital ethos, not just of automation, but of artificial intelligence in general, is that it inhibits our ability to think meaningfully about the future. Because what ends up happening is that every political question ends up being framed as a choice of trends of technological development, right? That's number one. I mean, I think this digital kind of a mindset is very anti-political. I think you're absolutely right about that. I'd also want to emphasize that from the standpoint of mercenary rationality, the brilliance of these, what are often called brilliant technologies, doesn't reside in, I would say, microprocessed intelligence, but rather in their use to expedite the quantification of labor. And even more so, the surveillance of labor. This is brought out by, I'm sure you probably read this, Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Is a really harrowing book in a lot of ways. Even though I think that a lot of the political suggestions that even she makes are rather too tepid. They don't go far enough. I urge everybody here to pick up that book. It's really in many ways it's a warning of the future is already here, folks.
Yeah.
And I also recommend another one, Adam Greenfield's Radical Technologies, which I think that's a double entendre, because on the one hand, they are radical in the sense that he thinks they could be used for some left radical purposes. But what seems to be the case when I read it was what he means is they are radically transforming us, and in ways that Greenfield does not think are healthy. Oh yeah, one more thing. I mean, which relates, much more immediately to ecological questions. One of the things that bothers me about a lot of the discourse about automation across the political spectrum is I usually read or hear very few questions being raised about what's going to be the ecological impact of automation. One thing it strikes me that global warming, it seems to me, will put even more stress on an infrastructure that already operates at high temperatures, right? I mean, when you've got this infrastructure of data centers and laptops that already generate enormous amounts of heat and that require huge systems of air conditioning to cool them down, well, I mean, automation is just going to put that on steroids. So I'm just wondering whether these people are thinking about whether a fully automated economy, I mean, set aside like the human consequences of that, the ecological consequences, it seems to me, would be utterly, like unimaginably bad. And so especially, it seems to me, people on the left who are celebrating automation, I'm not joining the party. I mean, based on what I'm hearing and reading about this. So,
yeah.
And I just have to quote this one neoliberal journalist, Amity Shales. She gave perfect evidence for the thesis of my book. I saw this on Twitter. She said, "Markets cannot fail. We fail markets."
Yeah, there's a syntax error there, I think, something about that. Well, thanks to you both. I want to say, we're at 8:25. We're scheduled for 8:30. I just want to ask people if we can hang out till 8:35. And, there are like 30 questions from people. So I'm going to make one observation, and then I'll list some questions and we can chew on them kind of briefly, just so we can get some voices in here. So it is ironic in some way that we have the panopticon on the back of the $1 bill. When we think about Zuboff and surveillance capitalism, there's a message coming through the dollar bill that excites the literary minded of us. I think you're right, Gene, about mid-century Catholics. It's strange to me psychologically how you can be in position A and shuttle up to position B or down, whatever, shuttle up, and then you forget the position A ever existed in.
Right.
It's crazy. It's like, oh no. So we lose the prophetic edge of the gospel. We lose any number of social communities that are from unions and other groups. That's self-evident. I used to love to teach my dystopian fiction course, and I liked it a lot because it was more speculative and theoretical. It's less so these days. So you can see that. You talk about automation, Gene, and Dan, your stat out of the UK is staggering, man. And that's like 53 million jobs.
Yeah, just in Europe. That's just in Europe, right? Just in Europe.
So I was gonna watch my reruns of Black Mirror this weekend. I don't even want to do that anymore. So this is all becoming hyper real, and I think then the last thing on my observations is, boy, it sure is a good time to defund humanities programs. Yeah.
Don't give them any ideas.
Yeah. That was said tongue in cheek, my friends. It's not a good idea now or ever to do that. So that's my pitch for the humanities. But it's self-evident in our thinkers here. These are big problems that require humanistic understanding and, of course, theological. So here are some things from our friends. Okay, here's the first grouping. Is your assumption that all forms of capitalism are anti-sacramental? That's Bill Van Orden, number one. Number two, Pope Francis is an astute observer of economics. How do we convince Catholics that he is not a communist? Question three, please jot down thoughts, Gene and Dan, on these things. Three, how does universal basic income fit into a Catholic economic social teaching? How can it help going forward? That's an Andrew Yang-based question from our friend Jessica Stepp. Hi, Jessica. And then finally, for the first grouping, please devote, the flyer says ways to cultivate our advertising. Ways to cultivate a sacramental reality, sacramental imagination. So can we this question is saying, can we critique less and offer more in the ways of solutions under a sacramental imagination? So that's the first grouping. Please dig in as you like.
Yeah. as to the first question about capitalism being anti-sacramental, I think it's better described as perversely sacramental.
Yeah.
I don't think the world can be anti-sacramental.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the way I once put this was we've never been disenchanted because we can't be.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the world can't be disenchanted. It already is sacramental. It seems to me that the distinction is not between sacramental and anti-sacramental. It's between rightly or properly sacramental and perversely or parodically so. It seems to me that the sacramental character of capitalism is the way in which money acts as a kind of moral and even ontological arbiter, of what's real. One small example I'll give of this is in economics, there is a concept called effective demand. If I'm thirsty and I have no water, or I have no money to pay for water, I'm not thirsty, according to effective demand. I'm not thirsty. My thirst does not exist in the marketplace. That's not just a moral statement about supposedly what a lazy, guy I am that doesn't have enough money. It's saying my very desire does not exist by in the marketplace, and so therefore it's not real.
Can I add to that real quick, Gene?
Sure.
I think there's also something here about the kind of momentums and energies that are being that are articulated in both. I mean, Marx at one point in Capital says that capital cannot abide a limit, right? And so there's something about the motor of capitalism itself that does not withstand any kind of barrier or kind of limitation to its expansive growth, right? Mm-hmm. So if the sacrament also, in a certain way, is saying that as this is sacrifice is made, as it's consecrated here, that kind of emanates through all of the whole of the world. You have, I think, ultimately, kind of on a macro level and on an ontological level, competing agencies, competing energies. That I'm not sure those are reconcilable. I think we've been trying really hard, our best for years and years to reconcile these. And I think what we're finding is that the unlimited growth energy of capital is consuming absolutely everything.
And I guess the only thing I'd add to that is that the reason that capitalist energy is boundless, or what I should say is it tries to break all boundaries, is precisely because money is an abstraction, right? And abstractions are limitless, right? And so when money is the ontological fuel of the system, of course it's going to try to break all boundaries because it's an abstraction.
But what about Tom Smith's asked? He says, how will the worship of mammon then, cease? How does? Yeah.
Once again, I wish I had a crystal ball.
Yeah.
I think, I think to some degree, I would simply say, cultivate the traditional practices of prayer, contemplation, self-scrutiny. But look, as long as all of us are living in a capitalist system, we're all kind of forced to worship it, right? The money in your wallet is a sign of your devotion, to some degree. So I think we have to recognize that while we're living in this system, we're a part of it, and we have to, I guess I'm not asking for everybody to, say mea culpa every day, but also it seems to me that there are practices that we can engage in of mutual aid, of look, I do think that some political parties and some political figures have programs and policies that could help us, achieve some kind of a sacramental politics. Look, the Green New Deal. I think the Green New Deal doesn't go far enough, but it's a start. And it does seem to me that a lot of the Green New Deal is rooted in some kind of a notion of nature as more than simply a warehouse of resources for us to.
Can I add something there too, Gene? I mean, this is where you have served, I think, so many people well. Mike, your own discipline in similar way. I think one of the things that I think, so the question is, how do we end the kind of enchantment with mammon? Well, I think in some ways, what we all do is in some ways to demystify it, right? I mean, this is the thing about capital is, it's David Harvey's thing about no matter what history book you pick up, that's written in the 20th century, the middle class is on the rise, like it is a narrative that speaks its way back into history, right? And I think our job, whether it's through the reading of literature, whether it's through engaging in critical history, is to show that, no, this is an accident, right? It's a very powerful one, but this is not the way that things have always been, right? Which then offers and breaks open the imagination for the possibility, just as Gene did with usufruct, that, wow, there's not only one way to think about property, right? That wasn't written into the ontology of the world, right? Or the cosmos. So there are different ways to kind of conceive these things. And I think on some sense, that's, always the professor's job, right? To point back to education as, as what we need to do. But I really do see that as our task, is to demystify it a bit.
Yeah. And I mean, at least in the Enchantments of Mammon, there are a number of different sort of lineages that I identify as, again, giving us their historical resources for us to use. And some of them aren't necessarily Catholic. Some of them aren't necessarily Christian. Two that come to mind immediately are the anarchist tradition. One of the big surprises for me in researching and writing this book was how much sympathy I ended up having with the anarchists. I mean, when I started this book, I wouldn't have thought of myself as an anarchist, and I guess I still don't. But man, can you learn a lot from them? You really can. And also from the arts and crafts tradition.
Yeah, exactly.
Beginning in the late 19th century. And even I think you see examples of this all the way into the 1960s, with people like Theodore Rozak, who is just an extraordinary countercultural writer, even though I don't think in any way he was a uncritical, celebrant of the counterculture. Can I take up the question of the UBI?
Yeah, I think that'll be our last move.
Okay. I'm of two minds about a UBI, right? On the one hand, yes, absolutely. People need a UBI because, man, wages are falling and jobs are more precarious. And
by the way, it's universal basic income, people, just in case.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I should have made that clear.
Yeah.
And besides, just from the standpoint of keep stabilizing the capitalist system, I mean, it seems to me, if you don't provide a universal basic income, who the hell's going to buy all the stuff that's going to be turned out by the robots, right? So just from sheer survival, it would seem to me that the capitalist class would embrace some kind of a UBI, and some already have. I mean, Zuckerberg and I think Elon Musk have even made noise, about saying, yeah, this is probably a good idea in the future or something like this. But it's precisely the fact that Zuckerberg and Musk support it that leads to my suspicion, which is that it seems to me unless a universal basic income is harnessed to a larger program of transformation, it's just going to become a panacea. It's just going to become a way to just buy off discontent. Next it'll be give everybody, his or her own little ensemble of digital playthings to keep them from being utterly and suicidally depressed with their lives. So I'm of two minds about it.
Yeah.
This is my fear too, Gene. I mean, obviously there are many ways in which, I want to say, like, obviously from the feminist point of, domestic work is labor, right? It's a very strong Marxist point there, I think, made. And so, but my suspicion is too that UBI then becomes a way of backing out of all the social contracts that have been earned through the blood, sweat of labor over the, a lot of people, I was going to say this even when you were talking earlier, that most people with, when we talk about automation, we talk about the trajectory of capitalism, think, well, look at all these wonderful programs that are like, go back and read the labor history. These things were not given to anybody, right? These were won through hard fought kind of struggles for, getting kids out of the factory, the limits to the working day, that there would be basic insurances for injuries, that these things were not gifts of capitalism. They were struggles with labor and capitalism. And I think my fear with the UBI is that then everything you need to live on, yeah, here's your $1,000 a month. And we all know that doesn't go very far when you start paying your own insurance, when you start paying your own medical bills. So my fear is that it's a way to, act benevolent and back out of the real kind of pieces of the social contract.
Thank you, Dan. Gene, I'll give you just a final word for you, being our guest of honor.
I would say that so one of the questions that apparently was posed by some of the audience members was about thinking about solutions to this. Well, I mean, I guess I'd say that one of the takeaways from my book is that it seems to me that the capital R romantic, not just sacramental imagination, but the romantic approach to work, to technology, to the understanding of our relationship to the universe, it seems to me is increasingly the only viable one. I mean, it seems to me that's the only one that's going to lead us out of disaster into a much more generous and humane way of being in the world. I mean, I know there's a resurgence of interest in Marxism, especially among the young. And look, in some ways, I think that's all to the good. Yeah. Read Capital. You want to understand capitalism? Read Capital. But I just can't share the dialectical optimism. It just seems to me that if in fact Marx is right, you're not going to have any kind of revolutionary consciousness generated through this process. It's just going to be demoralization.
Well, I'd like to, you know what, I wasn't going to do this, but I will. I want to end with a poem from Denise Levertov, and it's her classic, Primary Wonder by Denise Levertov. Days pass when I forget the mystery. Problems insoluble and problems offering their own ignored solutions jostle for my attention. They crowd its antechamber along with a host of diversions, my courtiers, wearing their colored clothes, cap and bells. And then, once more, the quiet mystery is present to me. The throng's clamor recedes. The mystery that there is anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything, rather than void. And that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still, hour by hour, sustain it. Thank you very much. Blessings to all. We'll see you tomorrow, okay? And thanks for tuning in.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.